Okay, so without any further ado, let's get started. So some of you may recall back in mid-December 2019, we had a big flagship event called Shape Your Future with Data and Analytics. And this particular event was hosted by Sachin Nadella and several members of the executive leadership team. And at this particular event, we made two big announcements. One was the fact that Azure Synapse Analytics, which had been in public preview for some time with some of the modern capabilities such as the serverless SQL pools and the Apache Spark engine, and that had finally become generally available. So that was one of the big announcements that we made at that particular event. And the other announcement was this brand new service available in public preview called Azure Purview, our unified data governance service to help customers really tame data sprawl and understand their data estate from a centralized location. So what's the challenge that we're trying to solve? Well, we all know that data assets within our customers are growing at exponential rates. But not only that, where the data actually lives, the data residency is starting to span multiple locations, whether that be on premises, data that's living behind a SaaS service, or data that sits behind multiple clouds, not necessarily just Azure, potentially AWS and GCP. And this data can take multiple forms, from structured relational data to flat files to business intelligence reports and everything else in between. And so the challenge here is that if you don't manage your data governance properly, your data estate ends up leading to data sprawl and then unmanageability.
I didn't get that.
Of course, Siri. And which can lead to problems in making decisions based on your data. Now, typically managing the data estate and organizing it and making sure it's accessible, this is the thing that falls under the role of the Chief Data Officer or the VP of Data and Analytics inside of these organizations. Now, from a business perspective, their goal is to make data as easily accessible to as wide a set of users as possible. But at the same time, as they're doing that, these roles have to ensure that the usage of that data is compliant with all the different regulations or contractual obligations that are applicable to those organizations. So as part of that, they have to figure out how to balance two sides of this equation. On one side, we have, what data do I have and where did it come from a discovery perspective? But on the other side, we've got, well, what's my exposure to risk? Which data sets within my organization contain personal identifiable information, and is that data being used in a compliant way? So how can we help the Chief Data Officers do their job really, really well? So with Azure Purview, we are solving for data discovery and understanding and starting to provide the foundations for effective data governance. Ultimately, the idea here is that the better that you understand the data that you have, the more effectively you'll be in a position to use it. And so on this slide, you can see here how we envision and productize Azure Purview. In the center, you'll see something called the Azure Data Map. And this allows your teams to create an automatically curated and always up-to-date view of your holistic data estate. It keeps in place a set of assets about where files are in your system, where the tables are, where the Power BI artifacts are, all in one place. And this data map is automatically populated using scanning and classification system that's built in and provisioned under the covers of Azure Purview. And so for data sources on-prem, we provide you the ability to host the scanning infrastructure on your own premises so that classifications and automation happens on premises behind your own firewall. But for data sources in the cloud, we can connect to those, whether they be different data sources, scan and classify their content in order to be able to create an active metadata graph. And once you have this metadata graph that's always kept up to date, then you can use that to power these different user experiences. Now, the first two that we have in public preview is the data catalog. That is used for your self-service data discovery, and this allows your users to search for assets all in one place to find what matters to them. And the second is data insights, and this is ideal for data officers or data stewards who are able to come in and get a bird's eye view on where your data assets are and what kind of data assets are present in which portions of your data estate. So on this slide, we've got kind of a 10,000 foot view of the various high level components that make up the Azure Purview service. And so we'll start at the bottom and work our way up. So here at the bottom, you can see that we can onboard or register any type of data from any different source, whether it be on-prem, multi-cloud, or operational data stores. And so whichever type of data that we have, those where we can leverage this feature of automated scanning and classification is where we've got built-in connectors within Azure Purview to on a regular cadence automatically go into these particular systems and scan them, sample the data, and classify to understand what type of data values are being stored within these data stores. Now, a result of the automated scanning process is then this materialization of what we're calling the data map. And so the data map will start to materialize these data assets. So these are kind of real world metadata objects that will represent tables and schemas and columns. We have the lineage. So this is the relationship not only between data assets themselves, like how does a SQL database relate to a schema that relates to tables and columns and so forth, but also between data assets and ETL processes. So if we've got an ETL process in Azure Data Factory that transforms and enriches some data, how does that relate to the data assets, whether they be upstream or downstream dependencies? And then also the classification. So as we're sampling the actual data values that are within these data stores and automatically understanding, well, this particular column, it seems to contain, a driver's license number or an email address or a social security number and so forth. So all of this here sits underneath as the underlying unified platform. And the great thing about Azure Purview is that the platform is open. And so the Azure Purview API surface area is largely based on an open source project called Apache Atlas. And so this is great for a number of reasons. One, if you're a SI or a systems integrator and you're looking to facilitate custom use cases, whether they be custom lineage or custom entities that we don't currently support, you can use the Open API to do that. Similarly, if you're an ISV and you want to build your own experiences that sit on top of the Azure Purview platform, you can use the Open APIs to do that. So that's all based on Apache Atlas. It's been around for a while and is already kind of well documented. And then if we move up, we've got the unified experience, and this is also known as Purview Studio. So this is the out-of-the-box graphical user experience that we'll see in a moment when we kind of transition to the demo. And with Purview Studio, we've got the data catalog. So with the data catalog, we have the ability to search and perform data discovery and searching for assets that matter to us. We have the business glossary, which allows us to understand business definitions by looking up terms. And we're also able to trace lineage between assets to understand their origin and perform impact analysis. And this is not only captured, but also visualized in a nice lineage graph. And then on the right-hand side, we've got data insights. And data insights is great for the chief data officers who are looking for a holistic overview of their data estate. And essentially, it's a set of pre-canned reports where you can kind of quickly glean some insights. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we have various levels of integrations with the wider set of Microsoft services, whether that be Power BI, where we're bringing in not only the assets, but also the lineage between the data sets, the Power BI reports and the Power BI dashboards, whether that be Azure Synapse Analytics and being able to surface all the Purview metadata objects and have them surface within Synapse Workspace without having to leave that experience. And we'll see that later in the demo. And as well as Microsoft 365. And so if you've got M365 and you have existing sensitivity labels in the information protection module, we can leverage those and equally apply those sensitivity labels to particular assets and determine, are they highly confidential, or should this be for FTE's eyes only? So with that, I'm trying to keep the slides to a minimum, and we'll now transition over to see a Purview live, and we'll see how much we can get through in the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, so you can see I've already pre-provisioned Azure Purview environment, and I've actually got a couple of different Purview environments just because each of these are kind of set up a little bit differently to help show off various different features of Azure Purview. So you might notice that I'll be kind of flicking around a little bit. So we won't actually, provision a Purview resource from scratch because we've already got that pre-populated, so we don't have to wait. But when you do provision an Azure Purview account, the process is quite straightforward. The one thing that you will need to decide is things like the size of the platform, which we measure in capacity units. And so capacity units for Azure Purview determine the throughput for the platform. And so there's more information on the pricing page, but ultimately each capacity unit is equal to 1 API call per second. And you might be thinking, well, I'm not an ISV, I'm not planning to hit the API endpoint. I just want to use the kind of graphical user experience. That's fine, but you still need to provision the Purview platform, even if you're planning to just use the graphical user experience that comes on top with Purview. So in public preview, we have these two options, 4 or 16. So as a rough guide, 4 for non-production, 16 for prod. But we may see more flexibility here as we get closer to GA. And then similarly with all the modules, they're currently all available out of the box as public preview, and this might chop and change as we get closer to GA. Okay. So once you have your Purview account provisioned and you log into navigate to the actual Purview resource, you'll see this big button here that allows us to open Purview Studio, which will bring us to this screen here. So this is what the unified experience looks like. So we'll do a quick tour of the UI. So on the left-hand side, we have this kind of collapsible side panel, which has the 5 activity hubs. So at the moment, we're currently on the home screen, but we'll kind of slowly make our way through the other activity hubs as well. Okay. At the top, we've got a couple of quick action buttons. So this first one is release notes. So this is stuff that will come from the product team on recent changes to the service. This next button is the ability for us to be able to quickly switch between different accounts. So if you have more than one Azure Purview account within an Azure subscription, you can use this to quickly kind of toggle between those. The next is notifications. You'll get notifications for different reasons. One reason may be that you've triggered a scan of a source system to run, and if that scan has passed or failed, that notification will appear there. Next is just help. So we've got some quick links. And then the last one is feedback. So if you want to send some feedback to Microsoft, you can do that here. So these buttons will persist up on the nav bar up at the top. So if we kind of focus our way down the home screen, so here we've got the name of our Purview account. Now, if we wanted to change that because we've deployed this at a particular customer site and they don't want to see the technical name that's come from the actual resource, if we head on over to Management Center, we can actually change that into a nice friendly name. So, Azure Purview demo. And that will overwrite that friendly name on the front. Okay. And then so just below, we've got a couple of high-level metrics. One is the number of sources that we've registered with this particular Azure Purview account. The next is how many assets have actually been discovered and cataloged. So how many do we have in the catalog that we can kind of do random searches on and try to find what matters to us. And the next one is how many terms do we have in the business glossary? So at the moment, in this particular environment, we've got 9 glossary terms. Okay, so front and center in the home screen, we've got the search bar. One thing to note is that on every other screen, you'll notice that the search bar is always persisted in the nav bar. So no matter where you are in Purview Studio, you can always kind of get to the ability to kind of search assets at the top. But on the home screen, it's front and center. And we'll have a look at what that search experience looks like in a minute. In terms of these links here, we've got Knowledge Center. So Knowledge Center is just some tutorials and videos and blog posts on how to get started with Azure Purview. The next is the ability to register sources. So this button here is just really a shortcut to sources, and we're going to see that in a moment. So we'll just leave that for a second. And the same goes for Glossary. This is actually just a shortcut to the Glossary Activity Hub, so we won't click on that at the moment. And then Browse Assets. So Browse Assets is just a different way of navigating the same catalog, but by source, as it kind of suggests in the description. So to contrast that, if we just do a quick wildcard search of the catalog, you'll see this is what the typical user experience looks like. Like I have my filters, I have all my different assets, but this is kind of a, this is great if I don't really know what I'm looking for. I might know a keyword, I might know a little bit of information about the particular asset that I'm looking to find more information on. But I don't know exactly where it is. But if you do, and you want to kind of explore the catalog in a more of a structured fashion, if we click on Browse, we can see we've got the list of sources here. So if I pick on like Azure Data Factory, it will be a structured hierarchy that will start to navigate down. So here we've got an ADF instance, but I might have a whole bunch of these. So we'll click on this particular instance. And within that instance, I'll see the pipelines, and within a pipeline, I'll see the copy activities. So it's a kind of really structured way of navigating down the asset hierarchy. And then lower down the screen, so recently accessed, so these are items that I have recently accessed myself. So each user will have a different view here, depending on the items that they've accessed, and that's a good way for them to quickly go back to what they might have used before. And then my items are items in the catalog that I'm actually assigned to as a contact. So myself, Tegan, I'm assigned in this case as an owner, and in this other case as an expert. So if I drill into one of these assets, you'll see there is like a contacts tab. And we have two different types of contacts when it comes to assets. So owners. Owners are typically, senior execs in the business. They may not necessarily be SMEs about the asset, but they own the business process, or they own the data. Whereas experts we can assign, and they will be typically a subject matter expert. So if I was searching for the customer SQL table and I found it, and I wanted to ask someone about more information around this particular table, I might want to speak to the expert rather than the business owner. Okay. And then finally, on the right hand side, we've just got some links to more information. Okay, so let's head on over to sources. And so you can imagine, so at the moment, let's pretend that we've just provisioned the Azure Purview account. Now, at that point, nothing has been registered. We would have 0 sources, we would have 0 assets. And so one of the first things that we need to do is register a data source to start to build out our data map. So if I click on register, you can see here we have a list of out-of-the-box connectors that we currently support. Some of these are for first-party services that reside in Azure, and then we also support non-Microsoft sources as well. And this list is growing all the time. If anyone has been using this service since we went public preview back in mid-December, you would know that this list has already kind of grown, and we're expecting it to kind of grow more and more as as time progresses. So I'm going to I've got a number of different sources here. You can see like where we've got these kind of multiple little tags. They're just indicating sources where we can kind of register more than one thing at once. And so if I pick on Azure as a whole, I can actually register an entire Azure subscription, or I can register an entire Azure resource group. So I don't have to do each source one at a time. But if we go back, I'm going to actually just register an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. And so the types of things that I need to select, so I've got one, I just need to pick my subscription. And then as I'm clicking around on these different menus, behind the scenes, it's pinging the Azure resource graph and working out, hey, Tegan, what do you actually have access to? And so here are the storage accounts I have access to, and that's it. That's all the required fields. Now I'll explain, I've left collection blank, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, but otherwise we just kind of click on register. And you can see there, because I didn't assign it a collection, it's kind of appeared off and off here on the right hand side, which is perfectly fine. But in terms of that collection functionality, and you can see here we've got the ability to create new collections, but I already have some collections pre-built. Collections are simply So let's zoom out. Collections are simply ways to logically group sources. And so you can see here I have a existing collection hierarchy, and I've already kind of grouped them into groups that make sense. In this instance, I've got the storage accounts grouped together, the SQL-based environments grouped together, and so forth. But in a real-world environment, you might create a parent collection for the entire business or the entire organization, and maybe you have sub-collections that group up the sources that belong to a particular business unit or a particular department. And then we can kind of collapse these, just kind of clicking the plus and minus buttons. So, sources can either be orphaned or they can be part of a collection, just to make sure that they're kind of logically grouped and easier to kind of manage. Now, at this point, we've registered a source, but still we haven't actually got any assets yet. So we've got one source if this was the only one that we registered, but we need to actually trigger off a scan in order to start to get Azure Purview to parse this source and work out what's actually inside of this, in this instance, this data lake. Now, I've got an existing data lake environment which we can start a scan. Now you'll see all these buttons at the bottom of the tile. So this one here will allow us to trigger a new scan. Okay, so I'm going to click on that. And then these next couple of screens, while we're doing this for an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account, it's very consistent across most of the sources. So the kind of steps that we're going to walk through now will be pretty much the same, whether you're doing it for a data lake or a SQL database or some other type of source. So the first thing is that what's the name of our scan? And the reason why we're giving our scan a name is because this is going to potentially be used again and again. It's going to be a repeatable scan configuration. So once we've set this up once, we may want to run this scan on a regular cadence. Now, you can see in the message here and just below that we've also kind of need to specify what's the credentials that we want to provide Azure Purview in order to be able to successfully read this particular source and access the containers, the folders, and then the files. And so Purview has a managed identity that's available out of the box. Now, I've already made sure that this particular identity, which should still have access. Yep, so we've got a successful connection, but you may need to do a pre-step of just making sure you assign the right RBAC role to that particular managed identity. The managed identity isn't also the only option. You can see here we've got the ability to specify new. So you can use, if it's a SQL-based environment, it might be a SQL logon and so forth. It can kind of vary. So let's click continue. So the next screen is asking us, well, what's the scope of our scan? And so by default, it's selected the entire Azure Data Lake, but maybe I only want to select a particular subsection of the Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account. So I might only want to do the Kaggle parent folder and all the kind of children beneath that. So you've got that flexibility when you're setting up a scan configuration to limit the scope. But in this instance, I'm just going to select all. Okay, and so the next one is asking us, well, what's the scan rule set that we want to pick? So you might be wondering, what is a scan rule set? If we look at the details of this existing one, which is, you can see it's provided by default. If I click on view detail, the scan rule set essentially just determines two things. One is what's the file types that are in scope for the scan. And you can see here we've got a whole bunch of file types that are currently in scope, such as JSON documents, CSV files, text files, TSV files, and so on. And then the other is what's the classification rules that are also in scope. So if Purview can sample the data that's within these files and try to work out what's the actual data types and tag them with these classifications, which ones do we want to run? The 105 that are selected are the 105 that are currently system built. So we kind of get those for free just through the Azure Purview servers. But you can see at the bottom here, while we don't have any selected, we do have the option to also specify custom classification rules. Okay. So I'm going to use the default, but there may be instances where you want to set up your own custom scan rule set, because as an example, you may only want to look at a particular file type. So maybe you're only interested in Parquet, or maybe you're only interested in testing for certain subset of classification rules and not testing for the entire 100 5. And so that could be a reason why you might want to set up a new scan rule set, but we'll select the default. Next is the trigger. So what's the cadence that we want to run this scan? We can set this up on a recurring schedule, but I'm going to just toggle that to just run once. But you might want to run that daily, weekly, monthly, depending on how often the data might change. And then that's it. So we're just going to review our scan. We'll click on Save and Run. And then behind the scenes, that's going to kick off some serverless compute that will start to initiate the scan and start to read the Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account based on our scan configuration with that managed identity that has access. Now, if I want to check on how that particular scan is going, I can click on this View Details button. And you can see, even though I've run some other scans before, there's this particular scan that's currently in progress. So that serverless compute is being spun up and will start to scan that environment. Now that is separate to the capacity units which we provision that's required to run the actual platform itself. Again, the kind of Purview pricing page kind of gives a little bit more information as to the differences between the capacity units that's provided for the platform and the serverless compute or the vCore hours that's required for the scanning. But while that's running, we can see that we've already scanned this environment a number of times. So we've got some high-level metrics. We've got 19 scans that have run on this particular source. It's discovered 780 different assets. And of those assets, we've classified, the automatic scanning capability has automatically classified and tagged 573 different assets. We've got some other additional information, the ID of this particular source, and where in the hierarchy in our Azure environment does this particular source live. So I can see it's within this subscription and this particular resource group. Now this particular scan is going to take about 5 minutes to run, but because I've already scanned this environment, to see the results, we can just simply kind of do a quick search. So if I do a wildcard search, you can see all the different assets that I have in my particular environment. So what I'll do now is I'll transition to our Ninja tenant, which is a little bit more populated. We'll do that same wildcard search. Okay. All right, so we've seen at this point, we've seen the home screen and the different metrics and the different quick action buttons. We've had a look at sources and registered a source, understood how sources relate to collections and how we can scan a source in order to start to populate our data catalog. Now we're looking at the search experience. This is once the data catalog is starting to get populated because we're running all these scans. So on the left-hand side, we have this collapsible filter panel. Oh, let's just zoom that in a little bit, where we've got these 5 different ways of at a high level being able to kind of filter and narrow down our search results. So while I've done a wildcard search and we've got a number of, 384 different results, we might want to narrow that down. And so the first one is being able to narrow that down by asset type. So maybe I've searched for a phrase like finance or customer, and I know that this source lives in Amazon S3. I just don't know the exact name, but so I might click on Amazon S3 as a quick way to kind of filter those results to make them a little bit more relevant. You'll notice that as I'm clicking around on these asset types, we've also got these dynamic filters that are appearing just below. So because I've selected on SQL DB, I now can filter on the server, the database, and the schema, and kind of work my way down even further. And those filters will be dynamic depending on the asset type that I select. The next type of filter that we have is classifications. So as Purview is scanning these sources, and where possible, it is, so let's say we're scanning a SQL database that has all these tables. It will sample some of the rows in that tables and run all those classification rules, those 105 plus, that's built out of the box, to determine the data values within this particular data set actually match a particular rule. And so we're going to apply a certain tag on that. And in this case, I can click on this and see, okay, well, I can see here there's 11 assets that seem to have tagged that contain an email address. And so if I drill into this particular asset, I can see this classification has been applied at the schema level. And if I check out the schema, I can see, which specific column that particular classification holds that tag. So it's a good way to kind of filter our search results. So that's classification. Contact we spoke about earlier, so you can assign context to assets, whether they be owners or experts. So if I know a particular person is a contact for an asset, I can filter that way as well. So if I click on Will Johnson and I click on an asset and navigate to the contacts, I can see there's Will there. And then next we've got sensitivity labels. So sensitivity labels are also tags, very similar to the way that classifications are tags, right? So these are labels that are put on assets. But sensitivity labels are unique in the fact that they're tagging for something different. So while classifications is tagging for the type of data that's inside a particular data set, so this data set holds a person's name or holds email addresses or countries, sensitivity labels determine how sensitive the data set is. So is this particular data set highly confidential? And it's leveraging the unique integration that we have with Microsoft 365 and the existing sensitivity labels in information protection. So it's using the two products in conjunction. So you'll need to turn on the Azure Purview M365 information protection integration feature in order for this particular labeling functionality to work. But once you have that turned on, if we click on one of these assets, we've got Product Ninja, I can see the sensitivity label here at the top. And it's marked as highly confidential. And then the final way that we can filter our results is by glossary term. And so terms, we haven't looked at the glossary yet, but you will have a whole glossary full of terms that have business definitions. And then once we have specified those, we can also tag a term against assets. And so we can say, well, global markets. I click on the report table, and then I can see. So it comes back. I might pick a different one. So see at the bottom here, we've got our glossary terms. So these are the different terms that have been assigned to the particular asset. Similarly, once we drill in further, because you can see that the terms are hyperlinked, it will actually show the details. So I can see the actual definition for that business term. Okay. All right, and so just to finish off on the kind of the search and browse experience, so if we look at another particular type of asset, so let's drill in. So we're just going through into the details in a little bit more. So at the moment, at the top, we've got the name of this particular asset. So this is a customer table, and it is of type, Azure SQL table. At the moment, we're on the Overview tab, and within Overview, I can see some of these things which would have been derived automatically as part of the scan, and other things that have come from manual enrichment. So all these kind of technical properties below, they are more than likely just populated from the automatic scanning functionality. So when was it last modified, the fully qualified name, so on and so forth. The classifications, they can both be auto-populated and manually enriched as well. So these are classifications that have been applied to this particular asset, and you can see we've kind of got these two levels of altitude, right, in terms of where their classifications can be applied. One is on the actual the asset itself. So this is directly against the SQL table as a whole. Or we've got classifications that have been, have bubbled up from what's been applied at the schema level. So these are the actual individual columns in the table. And then same for glossary terms. So here we've got an example of glossary terms being assigned at the asset level, but under the schema, we can also see, in addition to classifications, glossary terms can also be assigned at the column level or at the schema level. And then on the right-hand side, we have, again, the hierarchy. So because this is a SQL environment, we can see the SQL server, which is related to which SQL database. We can see the schema, and then finally the table. Now, things like the description is an example of something that we might add as a manual enrichment above and beyond. And so if I click on Edit, I can go into here and update, this asset with a particular long description. Okay. I can also change the classifications manually. So while the classifications, some might have arrived from the auto scanning, if I know that this particular asset should actually be scanned with a couple more, we can do that. The same with the glossary terms. If I want to add in more glossary terms, I can do that here as well. And then if we transition to the schema, we can also manually apply classifications. We can manually apply glossary terms. We can override the data types that have been inferred by the Azure Purview scanning process and provide our own kind of friendly descriptions. So one thing we haven't looked at just yet is the lineage capabilities within Azure Purview. And so you can see here what is currently our focus is the particular Azure SQL table. But if I zoom in into the lineage, I can see that we have some upstream and some downstream dependencies. So lineage in Azure Purview can be both automatically pushed from certain ETL processing systems where we currently have support. So we support things like Azure Data Factory, Azure Data Share, stored procedures within Teradata, and lineage within Power BI. And you can expect kind of the support for automatic lineage pushing to grow and grow. But we can also have custom lineage pushed using the Apache Atlas APIs that are referred to at the beginning. In terms of the nodes that are on this particular graph, you'll notice subtle differences between this one that's currently in focus and some of the others which have this kind of squared off edge. So squared off edges represents data sets. So this is a SQL table or a Power BI data set. Whereas those with the rounded off edges represents a process. So this is like a change. And in this case, it's a Azure Data Factory data flow activity. Now I can click these quick action buttons to jump over to Data Factory and look at that particular copy activity and which pipeline it exists in if I wanted to modify it or inspect it for more information. Same goes for any of these other assets. Like if I want to switch over to this asset within Azure Purview, I've got quick links to be able to do that. Okay. Now, within the lineage, we also have the ability to search across all these different assets to understand not only where did the data come from, but what did it actually produce. And so if I come in here and I search, for instance, country, I can see that it's highlighted the country node, but it's kind of faded out some of the other assets. I can also do column level lineage. So if I click on some of the columns, I can see where particular columns, and if I zoom out again, where did they originate from and where did they end up? I think contacts we already kind of covered it again, that you can manually update those, and that will just be based on anyone that's within your Azure Active Directory. And then finally, in the related tab, so this will vary slightly depending on which type of source that we're looking at. In this instance, we're looking at a SQL environment. So when we navigate to related, it's looking at other tables that are within the same schema. And this allows us to kind of navigate up and down the hierarchy. So I might look at a different schema and see what else is related within that from a tables perspective. And finally, the last thing is this action button. So where we've got data sets where we can quickly consume those in Power BI, there'll be an open in Power BI desktop button, which will open up a pre-populated PBIDS file, which will have some of the connection details pre-configured so that we can quickly get started and consume this data set. So if I'm an information consumer in the business, that might be an easy way for me to find what matters to me, and then open up the PBI file to quickly start consuming that table. Okay. So let's go back. So we've looked at home, we've looked at sources, we've looked at the search experience and asset details and lineage. Next, we'll have a look at glossary. So in the glossary, you can start to define your own business terms and their definitions. And you can see here, I've got some sample ones that are already pre-populated, but if this was a new glossary, we would come in here and click on new term. And the first thing that Purview is asking me is what's the term template, the kind of the blueprint, so to speak, as to what I want to use in order to create this term. So by default, we have one that has some basic fields, but you may want to create your own term templates if you have custom attributes that are not being captured as part of the default. And so if I click on new term template and I say, custom term template, we'll just give it a name. You can see we have the option to create these kind of new attributes. So I might create one called cost center. And we can define, what type of field is this particular attribute? Is it text-based? Is it multi-choice? And if it is multi-choice, what options do we want to provide, et cetera, et cetera. But for now, I'm just going to pick the default. And these are the fields that we kind of get as part of the default. So you can see here we're using the system default template. And then in the overview tab, I'm going to specify, my first term. We provide a definition for that term. And one of the updates that came out of Ignite around mid-March was the ability to have hierarchical glossary terms. So we can have the same term name appear multiple times as long as they have different parents. So we can provide this particular term to be related to the Contoso parent term. So you might have a term that is the exact same name, but it means different things to different parts of the business. So you might create different parent terms for different business units. This term might have an acronym, so we'll call it MFT. And if you've got resources like links, we can add those with a name and whatever the link is. So we can say, https aka.ms/purview. Okay. Related, so there is two different concepts of relating a term that you're creating to other terms that might already exist in the glossary. So one is synonyms. These are terms that have maybe different names, but they have very similar definitions. And so we can go in and kind of pick what those terms are. And then the other relationship type is related terms. So these are terms that don't have similar definitions, but they just might be related to the same kind of subject area. So we might kind of group those up as well. And then finally, terms also has a concept of context. And so I can kind of search my Azure AD graph and I'll search for Christina and I can add her as an expert and I'll add myself as a steward. So I'm kind of responsible for the quality of these terms. And then lastly, at the top, you can see we've got different statuses. So by default, this term will be in draft, but I can change it to be automatically approved. And so we'll just create that. So I've manually created this term. If you have a whole bunch of terms that you need to create, you can bulk import terms. So you might have a CSV file. So you'll pick the term template, you'll download the CSV file. So that's a way to get a whole bunch of terms into the glossary really, really quickly. Additionally, again, you've got the Apache Atlas API. So if you want to do this programmatically at scale, you can use the Apache Atlas API to populate your terms. And then if we can find one that already has some assignments, so you can see this particular term shows that it's already assigned to assets in the catalog. So we'll click on view and I can see that queries by country has the aggregation term assigned. Okay. So next we'll look at insights. So insights is the list of pre-canned reports that we have that are available within Azure Purview. So we've got a different bunch of subject areas that we currently cover. I would expect that this list will probably grow again over time. So at the moment we're on the assets view, and the kind of setup for each of these pages is very, very consistent. We'll have usually some high-level metrics running across the top. So here we've got the number of sources, the number of discovered assets and classified assets. And then you'll have a well of just other data visualizations. And so here we've got assets by source type, and a lot of these visuals will have some quick filters at the top. So in this case, I want to filter my assets by source type, but I want to only see things that have been tagged under the classifications that fall under the personal category and specifically hold a person's name. And then if I want to drill into that, I can click on view more and then start to get into the lower level granularity and start to kind of pick out the specific assets that make up those results. So we won't go into each of these in details, but you can see we just have different graphs for different purposes. So this is to monitor the scans and the success of those scans. We have some insights on our glossary terms and those that are assigned to assets, without assets, terms that might be incomplete because they're missing some attributes. Insights by classification. So this is by the different classification rules that are being applied, and again, the ability to kind of drill more and work out which ones are classified in a certain way. Sensitivity labels. So if you do have that integration with Microsoft 365, you'll have the sensitivity labels and some insights in terms of how that's split up by the different assets. And then the last one is some insights on file extensions. Okay, so we're getting close towards the end. The only thing that I'll show is a management center. It might skip back to this environment. So Management Center, as the name kind of hints, is where a lot of the administrative stuff gets set up. So your Azure Purview admins might spend some time in here. We won't go through each of these, but one that I'll just highlight is the ability to kind of set up new classifications. So you saw at the beginning that we've got 105 plus system built classifications, but we have the ability to create new classifications. So if we do that quickly, I'm going to create a classification that I want to tag whenever it finds Twitter handles within my data estate. And so I'm going to create my tagen Twitter handle customer classification. And that's it. I just need to provide a name. So this is going to be the tag, and you can see the friendly name there, the tag that's going to be applied to the assets when it matches the certain rules. But the classification on its own doesn't do much. You need to also specify the actual rules that are going to roll up into that classification. So as you can see, the reason why they're split out is because it can be a one-to-many relationship. And so here I'm going to create a new classification rule, and because this is just one-to-one relationship, so again, I'll just call this Twitter handle. I'll find the classification name that this rule belongs to, so that's this one here. By default, this will be in the enable state, but you can disable classification rules if they're no longer relevant. And then we've got two different ways of creating classification rules. So one is a dictionary-based method. So if you've got all the possible values, you can just simply upload those, in a CSV file, and have those kind of put into make up your classification rules. Alternatively, we can set these up as a regular expression. So if I click continue, and I'll see if I can find, yep. So sorry, go back one step. So this second option is the regular expression based classification rule. Now, if you're not super familiar with writing regular expressions, this bit at the top is saying that we can actually provide Azure Purview some sample data, and it will actually suggest some regular expression rules that might work to identify this data in the future. So if I click on upload, I've got some Twitter handles here. And actually, so if I just quickly preview that data just to show you what that looks like. So you can see this particular data set has 3 columns, ID, some Twitter handles, and the URLs. And so it's generated 3 different patterns for each one of those columns, but the one that I'm interested in is specifically to identify the handles. So I'm going to pick on that and then click this add. And it's basically pushed down the regular expression to help identify not only the data, but how to identify the column. Now, because my columns could be called not just handle, they could be called Twitter, or there could be a number of different ways. I'm just going to leave this blank. Actually, I don't want to specify a column pattern. And I can see for the data pattern, it's done a decent job. I can see that it wants to look for things that start with the ampersand, that has alphanumeric kind of characters. But this plus symbol indicates that could be of any length. And I know that Twitter only allows characters that can only be a minimum of 5 or a maximum of 15 characters. So I'm just going to update that slightly, but otherwise that was a good kind of starting point. And then below here, we've got these kind of thresholds. And the reason why the thresholds are important is to kind of stop us from getting false positive matches. We don't want to just match or classify an entire column within a data set just because one value, for instance, matched. So we've got this first one in terms of the number of distinct values that need to be found in a column before the scanner will even run the data pattern on it. So in this case, the default is 8, but we can kind of make that up higher or lower. And then the second is what percentage of the data values need to match. So if we only get 1% match, that's probably not a good way to classify that rule. But in this case, we've got like 60% match is the default. Again, we can bump that up if we want it to be a higher degree. And then that's it. So we'll click create. So we've got a classification rule. It's related to our classification. And then if you recall, and we won't go through all of this, but when we went through the scan, in order for the scanner to know to use that classification rule, we need to make sure it's part of a scan rule set. So this default won't have this custom rule in scope. And so we can create a new scan rule set. Twitter scan. So this new scan rule set, and it'll ask us those two questions. What's the file type? So maybe we only want to look at Parquet files. And I'm not interested in any of the system built rules. I just wanted to look at Twitter handles. And so that would be a way to make sure your classification rule is in scope and used as part of a scan. And then we just kind of progress forward as we did with the other scan. Okay. Last thing before we close, integration with Azure Synapse Analytics. And so Azure Purview, as I mentioned before, has like a growing set of different levels of integration with the broader set of Microsoft services. So we've seen with Azure Data Factory being able to push lineage. We've seen with Microsoft 365 and being able to use those sensitivity labels for information protection. But here I'm in Azure Synapse Analytics. I'm no longer in Azure Purview, and within this Synapse workspace, we've got this Azure Purview preview under the external connections. So here within essentially a single click, you can link up an existing Azure Purview account. And so you can see here, I've got a particular account already connected. Now, what does that actually do? Well, once the Purview account is connected, if we go over to something like data, where you've got the Synapse workspace search experience, you'll notice we've got now the ability to not only search the Synapse workspace for objects, but we can search the entire Purview catalog. So this allows us to find assets that live even outside of Synapse and start to interact with them within Synapse that may not have even existed within the workspace. So if I do a kind of search for a Parquet file, and I can see here I've got a Twitter handles.parquet file that lives in a data lake that is outside of my Synapse workspace. But I'll click on this, and it's rendering the entire Azure Purview search experience without me actually having to be within Azure Purview. So I can see I've got the same type of ways to filter. I've got the same asset details. But what's unique are these two buttons. So these are unique and specific to Azure Synapse Analytics. And so I'm able to connect to this data set and quickly set up a new link service or a new integration data set to infuse as part of a pipeline. But what I'm actually going to do is start developing. I want to start working with this data, and I'm going to select the top 100 rows. And so if I click on this button, that will pre-create the code. I haven't had to write any code. It's going to run against my serverless SQL pool. And if I click on run, that will actually start to query this data set, which didn't exist in workspace, in my Synapse workspace, but I was able to find because of the integration with Azure Purview. And then you can see that we're able to kind of bring some data back, and we can start to work with that. Okay. Cool. So that essentially brings us to all the time that we pretty much have. Hopefully that demo gave you a kind of good overview and a feel for what Azure Purview can do at a high level. To help you get started, we do have an offer at the moment while the service is still in public preview. So one, customers can actually provision an Azure Purview account and receive those 4 capacity units for free up until the 31st of May. So if you're creating an Azure Purview account, and make sure to kind of select the smaller size at 4 CU, and it's the one account in your environment. That's the offer at the moment, so it's for free until 31st of May, but I would check just the pricing page just to make sure that your particular Azure offer is eligible. The other is that the metadata storage is currently free in preview, And finally, the scanning and classification of Power BI online and SQL Server on-prem is also free while we're currently still in public preview. So again, for more information, check out the Azure Purview pricing page. And that's it. So thanks everyone for your time. Hopefully we've managed to give you, a bit of an insight into Azure Purview and answer questions that you might have thrown into the chat, and we'll kind of endeavour to just close, I guess, any outstanding questions that you might have. But yeah, that's all that we have for today. So thanks again.